everybody. Welcome to our third and final lecture, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. I am Martha Lucy. I organized this lecture series with Aaliyah Palumbo, who is sitting right over there. Thank you, Aaliyah. Thank you to our AV team for your amazing work every time. Normally, I'm up here introducing speakers. Today, I am giving the talk, so I am going to be introducing myself. My role at the Barnes is I'm Deputy Director for Collections Research, Interpretation, and Education. But I am also an art historian, sort of in my spare time. And my work has focused mostly over the last couple of decades now on Renoir and the Impressionists. I've done a lot of work on Renoir and the sense of touch and the body in the works of different Impressionist painters. I co-authored the Renoir book on this collection with John House, which was published in 2012, and it's now out of print, unfortunately, but you can, thanks to my colleague Ali Boyd, you can now read it if you want on the Barnes website. There's a PDF of it under our research tab, so that's great. As you'll see tonight, my work as an art historian is, I like to do a lot of close looking, but I also like to bring in a lot of history, and especially social history, and to connect these things as much as I can. Okay, so we're going to get started. I am using a platform that was designed in-house by the Barnes. It's called our Visual Experience Platform. So what we're looking at here is room 13, the west wall, and in the Barnes, and it is the only wall in the entire collection that is comprised by the work of just a single artist, and that artist is Renoir. And I'm obviously not talking about the metalworks, just the paintings. There are, many of you probably do know that this is the Barnes has the largest collection of Renoirs in the world. There are 181 of them, and they are all on view except for one poor little lithograph. Something to know about Barnes's Renoir collection is that they are mostly from Renoir's late period. So from the period the period that comes after he kind of rejects Impressionism. So his Impressionist years are mostly during the 1870s. He exhibits with the Impressionists. He's one of the founding members of the group, helped to organize the first exhibition that we are celebrating this year. And then around the mid-1880s, he sort of does this about-face and decides that Impressionism is not the way that he wants to paint. That's not really what we're going to be talking about tonight, but it's just to say that the Renoirs that Barnes really loved the most were the late works, so things that were created that Renoir painted between, sort of late 1880s until his death in 1919. And so I think something also that's interesting is that a lot of people don't realize that people think of Renoir and they think of the Impressionist Renoir. He actually continued painting for like 40 more years after the Impressionist period. Anyway, If we zoom around on this wall, you can sort of see the way that his style, this work over here, all the way on the left of the nude, this is an example of a late work where he kind of turns away from scenes of modern urban life, life in Paris and its suburbs, and creates this kind of Arcadian fantasy in the south of France. So, I can't remember if I've said this or not, but 85% of the Renoirs in this collection are from the late period. What we're focusing on today is this little guy, which is one of the rare, like, sort of classically impressionist works in the collection. And it's a painting called The Luncheon. Although Barnes preferred the late works, he thought that Renoir had reached the pinnacle of his powers during the late works. There's a letter from, I think, 1924. Somebody writes to, a friend of Barnes's writes to him and says, which one is your favorite Renoir? And Barnes says, I can't, there's no way I could choose one. He says, it depends on the time of day, it depends on what mood I'm in, but one that I really do love is The Luncheon. So he bought this in 1913. It's also one of my favorite Renoirs in the collection, which is pretty much the reason that I want to talk to you about this today. So Renoir painted this while he was living in Paris. You can really see the sort of classic signs of Impressionism in terms of technique. I need to find. Okay. I forgot to say hello to everybody online. Hello and welcome to everybody online. I know that you're there. Okay, so Impressionist technique, just zooming in on the baguette here and the way that he drags these streaks of red through the baguette, the way that, look at that soup tureen and the way that it's just comprised of so many different colors. We sort of know that it's from being in the world, that it's probably silver. Here's one of my favorite details, is this wine glass. And I want you to just note how Renoir achieves this wine glass by, without the use of line. So he is able to tell us that there is a wine glass here and that it has shape and that it has wine in it just by the quick application of a few colors. So he was really quite masterful painter, sort of in terms of design, but also in terms of his use of color. I think some other sort of fun, just looking at the formal qualities of this work, one of the things that I think about, I noticed one time, and now I think about it every time I look at this painting, is the relationship between the lines on the wainscoting in the back, those hard, that sort of right angle, very linear, and the right angle of the table. So here you have kind of like a traditional way of rendering a line just through, or rendering a corner just through the use of line, and then go down to the table and look at this edge, which once again, he's just communicating this through color. So the painting shows a couple having lunch. There are several objects on the table. We've already been talking about them a little bit. There's the baguette, the soup tureen, a bottle of wine over to the right. The object sort of to the right of the soup tureen is probably a little jar of oil. There are, they both have wine glasses. with a little bit of wine left just in the bottom of the glass. We're not really given much information about the setting, so where this takes place. We assume that it's a restaurant, some kind of café. We don't see other tables or other diners. They do seem to be, we can sort of guess that they're probably sitting near a window based on the way that the light is falling. Seems to be falling mostly on the woman, kind of on her shoulder. You can see that her back is in shadow. The one piece of information that he does give us that helps us to kind of locate this painting is the hat in the foreground, the hat hanging on the back of the chair. That tells us that is a boater's hat, and that tells us that this couple is probably taking a break from a boating trip down the Seine, which was a very popular thing to do at the time. So this is just a photograph somewhere outside of Paris on the Seine. And because this had become such a popular activity during the 1870s and 80s, those women would get all dressed up, like decked out to go for their canoe ride, and then they would stop and have lunch in one of the little cafes or restaurants that opened up along the Seine. And Renoir painted these kind of boaters' lunches several times. Some of his, actually, I think probably his most famous painting, which we're going to see in a minute, is a boater's lunch. So, but first I just want you to, I'm just trying to kind of contextualize this painting in his work. You can see that this figure here on the right, he's got this kind of pretty distinctive hairstyle. And I can't remember his name, but he is a Renoir scholar identified him a long time ago as, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to come back to him in a minute. But I just want to point out that he is also the figure on the left over here. So you can see his hairstyle and his beard. So Renoir's, he would get together friends and have them pose in these scenes. You can see in the painting on the right, which is at the Chicago Art Institute, painted right around the same time, that you can actually see the boats in the background. You can see a woman wearing a blue dress, which kind of connects us to this woman sitting down. They're just relaxing. She's having an aperitif, just to sort of look and admire the brushwork again. This white, we know that this is a white boating shirt, but just painted, brushed through with so many lavenders. Okay. And where we know that this one takes place, we know that it takes place at the restaurant Fournaise, which was a little place, I guess not a little place, a pretty big place, on the Seine, on the Isle of Chatou, which was about 10 miles outside of Paris. And I think because this guy, whose name I can't remember, was a sort of habitué of the restaurant Fournaise, we know that this one was painted there. I think we can assume that the one on the left also was. And then, of course, Renoir's most famous painting, or one of them, the Luncheon of the Boating Party, also painted at the restaurant Fournaise a couple of years later than the ones we've been looking at. So the aspect of this painting that I want to talk about, it's not really, I'm not going to be talking about the history of boating. I just sort of wanted to kind of ground the painting for you. But what I'm really interested in about this painting is the intimacy that it depicts. And that's really the thing that drew me to this painting, is the exchange that is happening between the two figures. And that is really the focus of the painting. You know, we don't see the rest of the restaurant. We don't see the other patrons the way that even we do here. He just zooms in on this one couple, and notice how the chair is turned away from the table, kind of suggesting, and this is something that my co-author John House pointed out when we were looking at this painting, that the chair is turned away from the table, which kind of suggests, you know, this is a luncheon for two. This is a sort of intimate lunch. It's sort of private. Now, the reason that, well, let me continue talking about the intimacy here. I think that what I love about this painting is all of the brushwork that I showed you earlier, all of those things, but it's the way that they are looking at each other and the way that they're sort of their gestures, their body language. I'm always drawn to this part of the painting, not just because of the sort of amazing wine glass, but I just love the way that his hand is on the stem of the glass, because it reminds me of, it kind of creates the feeling of, you know, a meal where you might linger and kind of, this is something that I do, you just sort of spin the stem of your glass a little bit. It just strikes me as a gesture that is very kind of human, and he is just sort of this master of capturing gesture and the subtleties of human gesture. The way that she leans in, the way that it's sort of unclear who is speaking. She looks maybe sort of not as quite relaxed. And the reason that I'm dwelling on this, that I even sort of noticed you might be thinking, well, why would you be dwelling on the intimacy of this painting? It's a restaurant scene. It's two people having lunch. Of course they're going to be looking at each other and talking together. But when you start to look at other Impressionist paintings, you realize that this is kind of rare, actually. Especially Impressionist paintings by Manet and Degas. Now, I want to just say right off the bat that I think that the differences are subtle in a way. But when you start looking at them, this is Degas, this is Manet here, this is another Degas, and this is a Manet. And we're going to come back and look at these paintings more closely in a minute. For now, I just want you to register how there's not much human connection going on in these works, even though the figures are physically close. And then going into the next decade, the next generation of painters, this kind of continues. This is Van Gogh on the left, and this is Toulouse-Lautrec. Again, figures that are sort of near each other, but not necessarily interacting. So before I continue, I'm going to pull the lens out a little bit and talk about the broader context in which the Impressionists were working. Since we are at the 150th anniversary of the first exhibition, it's maybe also sort of interesting to reflect on the history of Impressionist scholarship and to in very broad strokes, I think that you can sort of characterize that scholarship as for many decades just really being focused on the technical innovations that Impressionism introduced, the loose brushwork, the palette that had no black in it, the sort of refusal to kind of to put sort of boundaries on anything, the way that an object can be rendered just with a few quick strokes. All of these things are remarkable, but it wasn't until the 1980s or so that art historians began thinking about the content of the Impressionist paintings and writing about the fact that these works were done during a time of enormous social and economic and technical change. The amount of change happening in the late 19th century in Paris, well, across Europe, across the world, I suppose, but focusing on Paris, is staggering. And I'm going to run through all of these changes very quickly, but just to sort of give you a picture, you have the Industrial Revolution, the rise of machines, this shift from things being handmade to things being produced in factories, which was a huge deal for Renoir, which we'll talk about in a minute. You have a population explosion during the last half of the 19th century. I think the population quadrupled. You had people moving into Paris because of the Industrial Revolution, taking jobs. You had new forms of transportation. This is Gare Saint-Lazare, the train station in Paris that I think opened in the 1830s. But all of a sudden, this form of travel was available, and you could be somewhere else like pretty quickly. And then the sort of astounding changes that were made to the city of Paris during the 1860s and 70s under the city planner Georges Haussmann. And you just have to sort of imagine Paris as a city that was full of winding streets, that was totally sort of medieval. And it was during the 1860s and 70s that the really wide boulevards that Paris is now known for were established. So we see them now all sort of glittery and pristine, but of course, there was all this construction and destruction and entire neighborhoods being razed. This the project, the city renovation project. There's been so much written on it, and it was so massive. It wasn't just about boulevards. It was also about establishing building codes so that all the buildings would be sort of identical, and planting trees, and really kind of making the city of Paris into something that was sort of coherent and kind of regularized. I'm showing this slide because it captures kind of some of the disparities. Paris was this very glamorous, glitzy city in the 19th century, sort of the center of modernism, but there were also neighborhoods like this. This was also the era of the rise of leisure and the entertainment industry. The boating that I was talking about is part of that history, but you also had the opera and the ballet, and this is the Paris opera that was built in 1870. And over here, some people doing the can-can at the Moulin Rouge. There were café concert where you had vaudeville acts, you had singers, dancers. This was the sort of real beginning of kind of the world of entertainment. And the reason that this world and that leisure had become such an important part of life, that even happened, was because of the rise of the bourgeoisie. So this was an enormous and increasingly powerful middle class that arose in the wake of the French Revolution, after the fall of the aristocracy. And so all of a sudden you had this big middle class that was aspirational. And they had a sort of uncertain social status. They weren't aristocrats, they weren't peasants, but they were ready for consumption. This new dizzying consumerist landscape has been called by Walter Benjamin the phantasmagoria. My point here is that this was a hugely destabilizing time, and that basically the old models for living and old systems of belief, which at one time, for a long time, gave people meaning and structure, had sort of been swept away. Kind of like what's happening to us now. So the Impressionists lived through all of these changes. We have to remember that when we're looking at these beautiful paintings. They lived through these changes, and they captured them. In especially artists like Manet, Degas, Monet, Renoir to some extent. They captured the spectacle, they captured the changes, they captured the sort of the hypocrisy and sadness beneath all the glitz and glamour of Paris and its suburbs. They developed a visual vocabulary rooted in fragmentation and ambiguity and quickness. And I'll just kind of quickly take you through these to show you specifically how there are many ways in which each of these paintings engages with the modernity of Paris that I'm talking about. But here, just to show you, this is Caillebotte, and here you see the boulevards, and you see that very sort of regularized architecture under Haussmann. In this Degas, you see the rise of sort of spectacle, of entertainment. This is a singer on stage. And notice the electric lights, which were new. This is probably, this is Manet's bar at the Folies Bergère, which also conveys the kind of rise of consumer culture and the entertainment industry. And notice up here, this is a great little detail. Sorry, I'm having some trouble. Okay. On the top left, you see those two legs with the little feet? The green feet. That is a trapeze artist. So this is a bartender there's a mirror behind her, and we're seeing the crowds, we're seeing the entertainment industry in Paris. We're seeing all sorts of products. You might recognize the Bass Ale label right there. Another example of entertainment and leisure, a Degas ballet scene. And here Degas does sort of show you that kind of, that underbelly, the kind of hypocrisy, I guess, of the bourgeoisie, because this is a gentleman who paid for the privilege of hanging around backstage and going into the dressing rooms. Monet, painting Gare Saint-Lazare, and I love this painting. This is also a Monet, showing people in the countryside and these clouds, and you'll notice that this puff of smoke here, this trail of what looks like clouds is actually smoke coming from this train. Okay. So now bringing us back to, sorry. Sorry, I'm having a little. Okay, so now bringing us back to the café scenes, you can see these sort of aspects of modernity here too. These are probably prostitutes sitting out on the boulevard. This one here, and notice the probably client walking by. The performance happening in this one in the background. This is a performer that you're seeing in the mirror, reflected in the mirror. The mixing of classes. So here we have a bourgeois gentleman and a working class woman smoking a cigarette. And this one also really conveys the sort of hustle and bustle of the new city. You know, the Manet is a painting that zooms in on these two figures, but also really lets you know that this is a crowded place, and there's not a lot of room in here. I want to focus on this one for a minute because it really does kind of catalog all the signs of modernity. I guess the spectacle, the performance in the background that I talked about, the mixing of classes, and then when you come back to the Renoir, you can really see how much Renoir's Luncheon has been emptied out of all the signs of modernity. You know, there's no crowd. There's no apparent mixing of classes. But I think that the closing off of the signs of modernity is one of the major ways that he does this is through the intimacy that he depicts, the way that the figures are interacting. So I like comparing these two paintings because they both zoom in on two figures, but they're so different. And something that is pretty obvious, I think, but which I haven't used the word yet, there is a sense of detachment that you see in the Manet. The woman's face on the left, she is sort of just drifting off and looking to the left. She's sort of inscrutable. The fact that these two figures are, I'm sorry, I'm having some technical problems. Just don't have any place to put my notes. Okay. the fact that these figures are sitting so close together, but they're strangers, they don't know each other. The way that everybody in this painting, in the Manet, is actually looking in a different direction. Every figure. Even the waitress standing up and drinking a beer, even the performer in the background. So it has this kind of energy that goes outward, communicated through the gazes. And then the cropping of the figures kind of adds to that sense of this painting that's kind of spilling away from the center. And it's so different from the Renoir, where everything is kind of organized around the center of the painting. It's all about this area between where the two interact. And you can see that, look at how everything is kind of pointing to that center. The loaf of bread, the knife, the woman's arm. Everything is sort of directed there. And of course, their gazes. So it's that area that is important and that holds us. So what do we make of all of this? How do we understand Renoir's penchant for warmth and intimacy against what these other artists are doing? The usual interpretation in the Impressionist literature is that Renoir was simply retrograde. That whereas the other Impressionists, I've shown you a couple examples where Degas and Monet and Manet were engaging with the experience of modernity, all the artifice of modern life, the sort of shifting around of classes, the commodification of the spaces of the city, the social, technological, economic changes that were happening. That while these other Impressionists were engaging with all of this stuff, that Renoir, what is typically said is that Renoir was just turning his back on all of these things, that he just turned away from the complexities of modern life, and that he's just a purveyor of sweetness, and just wanted to paint pretty things. His paintings are described often as saccharine. He is not, there are some art historians who say that we should oust him from the modernist canon. He's not properly critical. One critic calls him Pollyanna with a paintbrush. So I am definitely not going to I'm not going to deny the sweetness of Renoir's works and the warmth of his works. But I do think that it's wrong or maybe just sort of overly simple, to read qualities like warmth and kind of intimacy as a vacuous form of picture making that is devoid of social engagement or any critical edge. The qualities that Renoir brings out in a work like the Luncheon, let me get to a slide just of it. Oops, I'll go back to this. The qualities that Renoir brings out in a work like the Luncheon, I think that they need to be understood as coming out of history, as historically rooted. I think that the intimacy that we see in a painting like the Luncheon, it carries a lot of meanings. Renoir is not just being kind of sentimental and hokey. He is depicting a way of being, sort of intimacy as a value during a time when the nature of social relationships were sort of changing right under everybody's feet. I want to emphasize that Renoir was deeply critical of modernity. He railed against electricity, sewage pipes, baby bottles, railways, corsets, everything. And he knew it, and he said, "I'm the biggest old fogey there is." And so this is why, and he had very kind of retrograde views about women. But I don't think that, I think that it's more complicated than Renoir is just a retrograde artist. It's not just that he wasn't just opposed to progress. He wasn't opposed to progress. He was opposed to the way that progress was happening in this modern city. So there is a biography of Renoir that was written by his son, Jean Renoir. And during their conversations, Jean says, Renoir would invariably turn to the subject of Baron Haussmann, the city planner. He was very upset by the regularization that Haussmannization represented. These identical buildings that we see on the right, the straight boulevards. For Renoir, it represented mass production, almost as much as sort of the factory did. He said, one of my favorite quotes that he says, "What have they done to my poor Paris?" More than anything, Renoir vehemently was opposed to industrialization and mass production. And I think his suspicion of mass production and Haussmannization were really coming out of the same place. It's this fear of, or a sort of loathing for regularization, for systematization, because he believed that what was being lost in this increasingly mechanized and commercial world was the tradition of individual craftsmanship and art, all the artisanal, all the values that were associated with it. Renoir himself had started out as an artisan. He hand-painted porcelain plates, a trade that in his lifetime was lost and given over to the machine. I can't emphasize enough how upset Renoir was by mechanization. Because he hated the regularity of what machines produced. He actually tried to form what he called a society of irregularists. And he wrote a draft manifesto in 1884 in which he railed against monotony and regularization in all areas, especially in art. But it's a lot of fun to read. He talks about nature and how nature isn't perfectly regular. If you open up an orange, look at all the sections of an orange, no one of them are going to be exactly the same. In one passage in his draft manifesto, he specifically writes about tapestries and the use of the machine in French production. He writes, "The superiority of a shawl from India over a French one. That stems from the fact that one is regular and the other isn't. One is the product of a brain and hand, the other the product of mechanical skill." And so you see Renoir in so many of his works. Here he's actually representing the act of hand making something. This is his embroiderers from around 1904. But the serene expressions of these figures, it's not, so what they're doing is they're weaving a tapestry. But it's also the composition of the painting, the kind of closeness of the figures, the warm colors that help to convey that labor that help to present labor as a loving human effort rather than a process of mechanized repetition. Of course, Renoir was also thinking about how new modes of production affected the worker. He felt that the city had failed its mission by not fighting for the expression of the individual. And Jean Renoir says, instead, this is the son summing up his father's feelings. Instead, the city had put itself in the service of mercenary interests and favored mass production. And Jean Renoir continues, an object, even one intended for temporary use, was interesting to my father only if it was the authentic expression of the workman who had made it. The moment the workman became part of a group in which each member was a specialist in one stage of the making, the object in question, in Renoir's eyes, became anonymous. And so where I'm going with all of this is that I think that the focus on human connection in the Luncheon, but in so many of his other paintings too, was actually a kind of strategy of rebellion against the new set of social relations, relations between people, but also between laborers and their product, that were coming to define the modern experience. In 1903, the German sociologist George Simmel wrote about the psychological effects that cities were having on the people who lived there. He wrote this famous essay called The Metropolis and Mental Life. And in it, he analyzed the economy, but the attitude of detachment that city dwellers take on. The phenomenon of sort of what he calls pretend indifference. And I just kind of want to point out how detached the figures are from one another in this painting. Not one of them is interacting with anybody else. This woman on the right is kind of staring off into space, as is the man at her table. This woman sitting in the chair with her back to us looks like she's just kind of staring off into space. There's the column that kind of, fragments these people just sort of compositionally. So, and then over here in this Degas, which is a portrait of Degas' friend with his daughters, I think you can sort of see the detachment here, and the way that the center of the painting is just kind of empty, and again, nobody's looking in the same direction. But Simmel, the guy who wrote the essay, he describes this detachment as a form of self-preservation. And I think that we're probably all familiar with this. The way that in the modern city, again, remember now it's the crowds, the population is swelling, that people need to detach themselves from the strangers and the objects, all the people that we confront at every turn, because there are simply too many stimuli for us to process. And so detachment was the prevailing attitude of modern life, and it was even embodied by a figure that we call the flaneur, who, the figure that kind of is an observer, that kind of walks around and observes and is sort of aloof. And so it's no coincidence that a sense of detachment comes across in all of these modern cafe scenes. It was the modern way of being. And I think it's striking to then compare the Renoir to the Gervais or Gervax on the right. Renoir was rejecting that posture of detachment, not just in the Luncheon, but throughout his career. And I love this comparison, even though it's a little bit like on the nose. These are done 20 years apart, but the left, they both are family portraits, sort of urban family portraits. And just look at the way that Renoir connects the family on the left, not just because of the fact that there's physical contact between them, but the use of geometry, the circle that holds them all together, the gazes that kind of hold them together. It's the sort of intimacy is built into the very structure of the painting. And meanwhile, in the Degas, all the figures are kind of spinning away from the center. Closely related to this attitude of detachment, something else that Simmel writes about is the modern experience of anonymity. That it's not the putting up of the wall, but rather the feeling as a person of being subsumed in the crowd. And again, I think we all have to remember what a new experience it was to be in a crowd and to not know everybody that you saw. So I think that this famous painting by Manet, it represents the hustle and bustle, the glamorous boulevards of Paris. But it also really kind of depicts the absorption of individuals into the mass. And just quickly notice how Renoir kind of refuses to do this, even when he's painting a crowd. He doesn't paint crowds very much, but when he does, we can recognize everybody. Everyone's familiar. He paints the crowd not as an anonymous mass, but as an aggregate of individuals. And we at the Barnes have a crowd scene. And you can see that he does, in the background, kind of blur out some of the faces to really convey the sense of the crowd. But mostly he is focused on these figures in the front. And they are individual portraits. And there's something about these crowd scenes where it's not just that he is painting individual faces and sort of differentiating these figures from each other physically and kind of letting us as viewers disentangle them from the mass. He's also drawing them into the human connection that they're having with each other. And I'm referring to the gestures, the way that the figures are gazing at each other, the way that the man on the left seems to be kind of pushing his friend with his arm on the back to talk to these women. Again, it's the subtleties of human gestures. And this hand behind the back, which I think conveys a sort of nervousness. This focus on the subtleties of their exchange is, of course, it's one way of drawing us into the picture, but it's also, I think, a longing for a world in which people, even strangers, are knowable to passers-by, a world where we can still read the signs of social interaction and decipher them. And that adds, I think, to the feeling of intimacy for the viewer. So even if when we're not quite sure what the conversation is, we can imagine the exchange, as one writer did when describing this painting in 1900. He sort of made up this narrative. He wrote, he and she interrupt their meal. A quiet joy rises from their heart to their eyes. Without speaking, they look at each other. They are deliciously happy about this day when in a little suburban restaurant they can hide far from Paris. So just see what I mean about knowability. And compare that to the way that critics responded to this painting by Manet, which is a fascinating painting and that we're not going to go into, but it's a luncheon in the studio, and it represents Manet's stepson. But it's, one critic said, these are types without character. He described the people in this as the faces of persons who pose. And the famous critic Castagnari wrote, and he actually liked the painting, but he wrote, "What is the source of Manet's sterility? It's that while basing his art on nature, so on real life, he neglects to make its aim the interpretation of life." So he's painting life, but he's not painting life. And in preparing for this talk, it helped me to understand a quote that something that Albert Barnes said about Renoir, something that I read a long time ago, but I've never quite understood it. But here's what it is. He says, "Perhaps the thing that most interests me in Renoir and that most strikes a personal response is what seems to me his joy in painting the real life of red-blooded people." It probably seems odd to connect a simple painting depicting two people having lunch with the new capitalist economy and the set of social relations that it brought about. But the intimacy that we've been talking about, this kind of rejection of detachment, I believe is really reflective of Renoir's profound concern for individualism, which he felt was under attack. We know that he was critical of the dehumanizing effect that mass production had on the worker, disconnecting him or her from the product of their labor, resulting in anonymity. And he was also critical of the impact that the new money economy, rather than the artisanal trade economy, had on the individual as part of society. And this is something that George Simmel wrote about too. In a nutshell, Simmel describes this world as one where consumers are cogs in the wheel of the whole operation. So it's, in a way, it's sort of like humans acting like machines or tools, and controlled by economic forces. And I'm wrapping up now. But just looking at the Manet one last time, you can see all the people in this painting as kind of cogs in the machine. Or the way that this painting is just full of transactions. The waitress serving beer, the performer on stage, once again in the mirror. And there's this feeling of kind of quickness and time slipping by that I think you can see in the cigarette at the bottom left. But also, and maybe I'm probably overreading this, but the coat rack in the back, to me, as I was looking at this, started to suggest to me sort of exchangeability, the kind of continual flow of people in and out. Oops. Okay. So if artists like Manet and Degas challenged the scope of capitalism by revealing it, by showing us the signs, Renoir challenged capitalism by suppressing it. And maybe this is just a retrograde strategy, but it doesn't mean that he should be cast out of the modernist canon. And I want to close by reading you this quote from Marshall Berman's 1982 book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air. And Marshall Berman was an American philosopher who writes about modernity. He's amazing. Okay, so think about Renoir while I'm reading this. To be modern is to live a life of paradox and contradiction. It is to be both revolutionary and conservative, alive to new possibilities for experience and adventure, frightened by the nihilistic depths to which so many modern adventures lead, longing to create and to hold on to something real, even as everything melts. We might even say that to be fully modern is to be anti-modern. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question online.
Okay.
And Anne asks, was there a perception that with modernity, intimacy was being sacrificed? Interesting to contrast in our social media world.
I think so, and this is something, this is sort of a new project for me, thinking about sort of the social history of intimacy. I did not get to research that much, and so I was making this assumption that intimacy was being compromised by all of these forces of modernity, but I haven't done the research to find, contemporary writers who are commenting on this. But I would say, yeah, and I do think that there are a lot of parallels between what was happening then and what's happening now.
Yes, Martha, thank you so much. That was such a beautiful talk, and I think I will say sort of by the end was turning into a bit of a therapy session for me. I think it was the talk I needed as I'm sort of grappling with my own sort of questions, I think as Anne was, about social media and AI and what is it to be human and what could the politics of intimacy look like? Yeah. And what are the politics also that how do we read artists of the past in the ways that we need for the present? But with that, I want to open it up to also questions from the audience.
Thanks, Allie.
Actually, if people are, do you have one? Okay.
Thanks, Martha. I wonder, as you were talking about Renoir's rejection of modernity, I thought about the sort of counterintuitive or the counter to modernity that a lot of artists pursued, and that was a search for Acadia and the primitive. And I wonder if Renoir's inclination was growing out of a similar interest.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill. And actually, there is an article by John House, again, the co-author of the Renoir book, called Renoir's Earthly Paradise. And it is about Renoir's sort of longing for a pre-modern world. And it focuses on his late career when he is painting these Arcadian scenes of nudes lounging about, and there's no signs of modernity. But interestingly, then he shifts and he starts looking at Renoir's earlier work, and he says, this is where, what I was saying about crowds and looking at the Moulin de la Galette and how individualized the people are. That's something that John House I think first wrote about, and so I think that he's sort of creating these utopias in the city, much as he does. He eventually gets away from the city altogether.
Martha, I have another question from online. Karen asks, do you think each artist, Renoir, Degas, was reacting to the social changes given the stark differences in their personal lives?
That's a really hard question, and I'm sure that their personal lives and their personal beliefs and their upbringings, their political beliefs all factor into it. But I don't want to try to answer that, except I will say that, I know that, well, I think I already said this during the talk, but it was very important that Renoir grew up. He was the son of an artisan, and he himself was an artisan early on. So I think that certainly shaped his his attitudes toward modernity. But yeah, these artists were all from, he was from a different class than Manet and Degas. Thanks for the question. I don't think I can answer it in a very good way right now.
Can I, as we're waiting for their questions, sneak in a question of my own, which is really just, I mean, it was wonderful to spend so much time with the painting. And, you know, I know that there's all of this reading of it as, you know, saccharine and sweet, and I can certainly, in the intimacy, I'm absolutely compelled by, and maybe this goes towards the intimacy, but when you pointed out that knife, I became fixated on it.
Yeah.
You know, and when I was thinking about, you know, you read that story by a critic from, I think, 1905, who tells this one story of the painting, but I could imagine another story of the painting too, and I was thinking about the way this sort of objects on the table do also, in a sense, almost kind of externalize the possible inner lives of these figures, and kind of have a, you know, or at least give you the materials to sort of tell a pretty compelling, different sort of short story of what's going on here. It's the knife just been put down, and now they're reconnecting. You know, where's the knife stand? So I was just curious, knowing that you've spent a lot of time with this painting, what you thought about that knife.
I had only been thinking about it as a sort of formal device, but I love what you just said, and I'm going to think more about that as a sort of externalization of, I mean, even if he didn't sort of mean to do that consciously, I think it's something to think about.
Yeah, I wondered about it as almost a kind of Chekhov's gun, you know, plot piece in the painting. Why is it there?
Thank you.
Sure. Are there any other questions? Oh, I think it sounds like there's one online.
Okay, one more from online.
Okay.
Beth asks, do we know if Barnes was attracted to the idea of intimacy as rallying against modernity? Sorry, that always catches me.
I don't think, that's a great question. I don't think that Barnes, he wasn't against modernity in the way that Renoir was, but I think he was definitely attracted to paintings that did have a sort of human quality. From, you know, going back to that quote that I read, I mean, I can tell you that he didn't really like Impressionism that much. And I think part of it was he saw it as sort of too superficial, as kind of too concerned with getting down the sort of surface effects. And he preferred painters who were really trying to capture something. I mean, this is not, you can find plenty of works in the collection that are not about human connection or intimacy. But, and here, Bill Perthes could give a much better answer about Barnes and human experience than I can, because but I don't want to say that Barnes was kind of anti-modern in the way that Renoir was, and that's why he collected him. I think that there are many reasons that he collected Renoir. I think the one that I think about is the way that he sort of straddled being a modernist, but also sort of a classicist in a way.
All right. Oh, it looks like we can do one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, please.
Yeah. Martha, first to thank you for a brilliant talk.
Thank you, Nina.
I enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you.
And you can guess why, because all the way I was thinking, that looks so much like Cézanne. He's, you know, anti-modernism. You and I know about it because we've had conversations. The fact that he retreats to the south and also is extremely upset by seeing the South being transformed and folklore disappearing, and then, of course, the machines and the trains and you name it. I would say the difference is that Cézanne displayed his anti-modernist in a misanthropic way. I mean, if we talk about intimacy, I'm trying to think how many of Cézanne's paintings have this intimate look. That's a human look, of course, right? And I finally decided, based on his diaries, his letters, and also the Renoir's own friendship and exchange, that his only exchange, meaning Cézanne's, was with nature. Nature was his place of intimacy. The trees, he actually spoke about the trees as humans, right? So I could say one thing in common was both Renoir and Cézanne ultimately created Arcadias, Arcadias of their mind, which they illustrated by, of course, images that go back to some, ancient Greek, probably, fantasy of, bathers naked in nature, etc., etc. So that's the most intimate I can think, if it's not Cézanne's
I love that,
with the
Nina.
trees.
Thank you. That was beautiful, and I think you hit the nail right on the head with Cézanne. His anti-modernism is misanthropic. That is one of the differences. I had a quote about Renoir and Cézanne that I'll share with you later that I had to cut out. But we should wrap up. I appreciate everybody kind of bearing with me. We went a little bit long. And thanks for coming out, and thanks to everybody online for tuning in. And we will see you next time. Have a good holidays. Thank you.